Hello everyone, welcome to the next video in the How to Brew series. Today I'm going to be covering how to brew aged raw Puerh. If you want to get really technical, this will be semi-aged raw, around 10 years. There's no real exact age limit for when a Puerh becomes aged or semi-aged. So that's something you'll need to experiment on your own and find the right tools and accessories to get the best taste profile and flavor you're looking for. You may also notice my lighting is a little different today. That's because it's nighttime. I often like to drink aged Puerh in the evening rather than the morning or the day. That's just my personal preference. Everyone has a different time of day that they like to drink this type of tea. A few things you're going to need to brew aged Puerh. In raw Puerh, I always recommend using a gaiwan because that gets the most true, authentic flavor and it dissipates the heat because younger raws tend to be more fragile. But as tea, especially raw Puerh, ages, something unique happens. It almost creates this durability to it. And it gets sometimes more deep and more abundant. So you're gonna need something like a Yixing teapot. Now, obviously Yixing clay is the best, though I do understand it's not as easy to get a hold of these as it was much more earlier in history. So if you have a clay teapot of some sort, it'll do fine. Maybe some other type of clay or stoneware. I use a Yixing teapot, and particularly just for raw Puerh. So this teapot only gets used for raw Puerh. You also will notice something else on my tea table. This is a small antique plate, and this is just a natural sponge. This is not necessary, but I like this because it protects the plate from the teapot for excess use, just to make sure they don't get damaged. This will allow for overflowing and excess water to keep the heat retention of that teapot. You can use any old antique plate you come across. You don't have to have this exact one. I don't even think this was used for tea, but I like the aesthetics of it. Then a tea pitcher and a cup. I recommend an old porcelain cup or a stoneware cup, similar to what you would use for a ripe Puerh. Though it of course will depend on the type of tea, how it was stored, how it was aged. Drier stored teas will take longer to post-fermentate, but preserve that natural, beautiful, aromatic quality. Wetter stored or more humid stored teas will accelerate that post-fermentation and become more durable earlier on. So as the tea ages, you can experiment with clay teapots and higher temperature. So I already have a tea that's I broke up. My hands smell very good because I was just breaking that up before this video. This tea is around 10 years old. And another unique thing about aged Puerh, which gets a little funny because tea gets more expensive as it ages. And sometimes as the tea ages, you need to use more of that tea to get the best cup. So normally I maybe use 2.5 or 3 grams for a younger raw, but something with a 10 or 15 year range, I might need to use 4 grams of tea. So I'm gonna use a little bit more tea than I would for a younger raw. And of course you need to experiment, right? And that can be hard if we need to experiment with an aged Puerh, especially if it gets quite expensive, I understand that. So just kind of look for a smaller vessel to brew your tea in. You want a little bit of smaller pieces and larger chunks together. You want a really well-balanced brew. You don't just want one big chunk or a lot of small dust. And this becomes increasingly more important as the tea is older. You want a really nice balance. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do just at 4 grams here. Perfect. Another little trick for measuring out your tea that I like is I like to use kind of a gaiwan lid to measure my tea. It's just kind of aesthetically pleasing. And then we'll be ready. So the first thing we want to do is prep the teapot. So what you want to do is you want to get boiling water as hot as you can get it. And then you want to completely fill the teapot, overflow it. One, this cleans the Yixing teapot because we don't use soap on Yixing teapots. And it just gets that heat started so we can appreciate that beautiful aroma. So we'll just wait for the water here. Alrighty, once it comes to a boil, you're going to want to use a lot of water here. So if you're kind of more cautious of the water you use, especially if you're using spring water, this first pass you can use filtered water. just to warm all of your vessels up, and then switch over to spring water once you've preheated everything. So what I'm doing is I'm completely covering this teapot in hot water. And then you'll need a wash bowl, of course. And I'm gonna let it sit there. I'm gonna wait until all the moisture has evaporated off the outside of the teapot. And one way I actually like to do is dump out this teapot is I actually like to dump it out from the side just to make sure there's any excess particles left over. It can leave the teapot. I don't want it to get stuck in the spout there. And then what I like to do is just cover that lid, let it rest. I want to get that natural aromatics. I want to learn about the storage in the aroma. I want to learn about the natural essence, if it preserved any of that personality from the original mountain this tea was from. Or if during the aging process that has started to kind of be more muted and the aged aspect of the tea is starting to be more pronounced. And you can even let it rest, revisit that aroma. There's no rush here. You don't need to rush into brewing the tea. Just let it rest. Aged pour tends to be more patient, more of a silent experience. You don't need to talk as much. Younger teas, I mentioned before, the more you're talking, sometimes you get that really nice sweetness in the mouth. But with more older aged pours, sometimes you just need time to rest and feel the tea in the body. So before we start brewing, I'm just going to warm up this tea pitcher and cup. And I'm also going to add a little bit of fresh water before we do the first infusion. Now, often you want to wash aged tea. I've talked before about washing and when to wash. If you know the origin, you trust the origin or the brand, you can drink the first infusion. But once you get into ripe teas and aged pours, you do want to do a wash. Now, this particular tea, I trust. I know the origin very well. I know the brand. And I'm going to do a wash, but it's going to be a very different type of wash. It's going to do an overflow wash. It's not a full wash. And I like to do this on semi-aged teas because I want to learn about the tea on the first infusion. So first infusion, boiling water. If you do have something like a cast iron kettle, even better, silver kettle, anything that's high heat retention. I'm going to use this fellow kettle because it has an insulated lid. It does an okay job at keeping that heat insulation and holding the temperature, but once again, just high temperature as possible. Once you move into aged pour, this is pour that's well over 30 years, you almost must use the cast iron kettle because you need the highest temperature possible. But semi-aged pour, you can use something like an electric kettle. So the moment it hits a boil, that's when I'm going to do this. Make sure all the tea is covered, and then I'm going to allow this water to overflow, getting all those kind of studs and everything else, and this will be my wash. Essentially, all that overflow was my wash, and then I will proceed to drink the first infusion. Now, this first infusion, you can do a very quick infusion. You just want to learn about the storage condition, the natural raw material, the quality of the tea. It does not need to be a long infusion. Sometimes aged tea does take time to open up, and other times it doesn't. It depends a lot on the compression of the tea cake. So once again, here, I'm immediately removing that lid, right? Allowing that tea to calm down and breathe. And you also want to allow that liquid to stay in that pitcher for a little while. So I let that liquid stay in that pitcher when I emptied this plate. And then I'm going to let it cool down and appreciate that aroma from the pitcher. And you may have also noticed that my color was almost a yellow, golden yellow. It wasn't really dark tea because it was dry stored. So it will keep that more kind of younger, raw, Puerh color, even though it's been almost 10 years. You also want a really nice translucent color. I'm not using a filter of any kind. And you want to make sure all the sediment sinks to the bottom. And be careful. It's amazing how much more this teapot can hold in the heat versus like I want. So this temperature may be a lot more hot than you're used to once you start using a teapot and higher temperatures for these aged teas. But those are some of the techniques you want to do to start and prep before you brew a semi-aged pour. You want to make sure this teapot is really hot. You have some kind of plate. And then I'll go ahead and do continuous steepings. And I'll slowly play with the steeping time. This is another mysterious thing about aged pour. There's just so many variables, right? Mountain, age of tea, how old are the tea trees, where was it stored? And that'll change greatly on when you're steeping it, the weather, the time of day, is it cold, is it hot? And each time you revisit an old tea, you may have to slightly adjust your brewing technique. So there's no matter of fact way to brew these aged teas. So you just want to err kind of on the shorter time. This first infusion is a great way to learn about how high am I brewing this tea, how hot of a temperature, and how long I'm brewing this tea. Because it's not really opened up yet. The whole essence of the tea is still slowly emerging. So by using the high temperature in a quick infusion and then tasting that first infusion, I can say, I think I need to push this tea. You would know you need to steep longer if the first infusion is too thin. You would know you need to steep the tea shorter if the tea is almost too aggressive or has a little bit of a sharp, aggressive, bitter characteristic. Then you know you need to do a quicker infusion or lower the temperature. But really important, first infusion, boiling water, quick infusion, try it, see where that tea is at and what does the next infusion need. Wow, this tea is very pleasant. You also will notice, like this particular teapot, I only brew semi-aged raw. So I brew a lot of Jingmai tea in this. I drink a lot of the 2011 Jingmai in this teapot. A lot of the 2012 bricks in this teapot. And it's kind of just molded to this kind of type or Jingmai flavor profile. So it works really well with these types of teas. Alrighty, so I'm going to get ready for the next infusion. I already refilled water once. I'm going to go ahead and go for a second boil, and then I'll add in new water, and then we'll get ready for the second infusion. You also will notice, depending on the type of cup you use, you have a really beautiful aroma left in the cup. You also want to be in a position that's very clean. You don't want your tea table too cluttered. Older teas tend to be more expensive, so obviously you want to pay more attention to when you're brewing it. You don't want to mess it up. But just a clean environment allows you to focus a little better on the tea you're brewing. Sometimes I'll slightly pat the bottom of the teapot if I notice there's a lot of clumping or clogging near the spout, because I don't want the teapot to clog up in the spout and then do a slow pour or even stop pouring, because then that can overbrew my tea. And that's why also I'm going to do a very slow pour from my teapot to control that and prevent that clogging of the spout. Yeah, I like how well this keeps the temperature. So we're going to go ahead and do the next infusion here. This is going to be a very quick infusion because I'm using 4 grams for a relatively small pot. I don't need to do another over infusion of this teapot because I already did that on the first infusion. And I'm just going to pour it out right away. That may be another thing you want to practice before choosing a teapot to brew an expensive tea. It's just pour water from that teapot. Just get familiar with that teapot. I've used this teapot hundreds of times, so I'm very familiar with the pour, how fast it pours, how much tea it can use. And those are just all good things to know especially before brewing an expensive tea. Just be really familiar with your tools before you start brewing that tea. You also can revisit the aroma in the teapot. It'll be very different from the tea pitcher and cup. You're also going to notice it getting a little darker now. If you really want that aroma to come out to its fullest, it's important to empty the pitcher in its entirety. You don't want any moisture or liquid left in the pitcher. Sometimes you have to wait for it to really cool down before the aroma comes up. So those are some techniques I use when brewing semi-aged Puerh. You will notice that this tea can be steeped many times, and the breaking point, meaning sometimes with younger raws, there's kind of this out-steeped flavor or over-steeped flavor. Like once you get to 10, 12, 13 infusions, it's kind of no longer there. You'll notice with more aged Puerh, it becomes more durable and that out-steeped flavor goes away. And it kind of turns into something that's more smooth and sweet and light. So just keep brewing this tea. If you feel the tea starting to get a little bit of out-steeped characteristic, just let the tea rest in between steepings. Sometimes with aged Puerh, even when you feel, wow, I think it's kind of hit its last infusion, I can't get much more tea out of it, let the tea rest for 20, 30 minutes. Revisit it with boiling water, and you'll notice some of the life come back. And so towards those later steepings, 15, 16, 17, let your tea rest 20, 30, 45 minutes in between steepings, and you may be able to get a whole new characteristic come back. And the last thing you can do with aged Puerh, once it's out steeped or you steeped it at all, put this tea in a tumbler and use it the next day. Use it the next morning. Add boiling water in that tumbler the next day. And sometimes with these aged teas, you can drink for 2 or 3 days, continually increasing that time in between steepings. And you'll be amazed at how many infusions you can get out of some of these older teas. So until then, I hope these tips was useful for brewing semi-aged raw Puerh. And of course, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to reach out. Remember to have fun, experiment, get familiar with all your tools, and of course, be happy and enjoy a good cup of your tea.